And today is about starting to collectively look at how we can work with local authorities, and there might even be some people on from local authorities, how you can work with communities to address the climate and ecological emergencies. So we're going to get some bits of the case study of Cornwall's second carbon neutral action plan and explore the necessary and sometimes contradictory needs of stakeholders and getting those all together to make an effective climate action plan. We'll hear about some tools, as David said, hear and talk about working with the traditional power structures within local authority areas. And Peter has a really interesting background for the work that he has done with Cornwall Council. We'll hear a bit more about that, but basically Peter was asked to join the Cornwall Council as the carbon neutral Cornwall sector and partnerships lead for almost a secondment, as I understand it. He's the co-chair of the Transition Network and was previously the community network manager of the Eden Project. His work emphasizes the importance of developing personal well-being and resilience, and specifically through building strong connections with one's community, which, is the main reason most of us are here today to listen. So without anything further, over to you, Peter, to add anything that I've missed. And tell us about your experience. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Pam. And hi, everybody. Really nice to be here, and I appreciate you all giving up your time. So I'm going to kind of jump straight in to the sort of first part of my presentation. So this is me, as Pam said. I'm the sector and partnerships lead for the Carbon Neutral Cornwall programme within Cornwall Council. I'm going to talk a bit about our approach to co-creating local action plans. And the context of this is we're in the process of developing our second action plan. I'll talk more about that later. And so I'm sort of sharing this not as a we've done it and it's great and it's working in every way possible, but as a you shouldn't have to wait for a story to finish before you start telling it kind of approach. And also it's quite humbling and overwhelming that this has been labelled as a masterclass, which is really nice, and I'm very happy to be able to speak from my experience in that regard. But obviously, this is one way of doing things, and it's not going to work for everybody. So hopefully, there are things in here that will resonate. And the structure of what I'm going to talk about is this. So kind of two stages. So first of all, I'm going to talk about our approach to collaborative engagement and how we approach this, and then in the second presentation, I'll talk about a practical application of how we've done that. And with both of those, I'm going to use this structure to try and make it as clear and easy for you all to follow, because it's easy to run off in different tangents. So I'll focus on the particular challenge we're looking at, the context in which that's happening, our approach, and what we're starting to see happen as the impacts. And I'm obviously happy to answer any clarification questions as we go. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat, so if you've got any questions in there as we go, I'll try and address those as well. Pam's already done a great introduction to me and my background, and I guess the different perspectives I'm bringing to this within Cornwall Council. So as a local authority staff member, as co-chair of Transition Network, and as a sort of a resilience trainer as well, and all of those things will probably come out of what I'm talking about. But again, this is just my perspective, and other people might come at this differently, and it's really interesting to hear how different approaches might be applied. So to start us off, I just want to talk very briefly about the risks in Cornwall. This is the context. So we declared a climate emergency in January 2019, and these were predominantly the reasons why it happened. It wasn't about thinking about the general risks of the climate emergency. It was thinking, what are the existing risks in Cornwall and how are those likely to be exacerbated? That's the kind of the risk currency or the language that people, decision makers in Cornwall understood. So if we could talk about The poverty that we experience is, a lot of deprivation in Cornwall, that's likely to be exacerbated. We've got a very vulnerable coastline, and we've got very vulnerable supply chains, including food and many other things. So that helped get the wheels in motion and set what for us is a 2030 target of carbon neutrality, so 20 years ahead of the UK government. And this is the challenge that we're facing. And this is a graphic I find helpful to use with councillors, with decision makers, that starts to get into the complexity of what we're talking about. Very often we lean into creating graphics or images about the climate emergency that are quite concise and quite neat and tidy, but that doesn't really help when you're trying to communicate this is a very, very complex problem with a lot of moving parts. And obviously this picture doesn't do it justice at all, but it's a step in that direction. So to frame the challenge, I just want to use a frame that I find really helpful and has really helped get a lot of conversations moving in the right direction within Cornwall, which is the difference between complicated and complex. So complicated here, represented by a bicycle. It's not a simple system, but it's understandable. You can predict what's going to happen when you put a particular input into it. And to understand that system, you need expertise. It's possible to get the right answer from that system. Whereas a complex system, like a cyclist, is not as fully understandable. We can predict what's going to happen. There are certain elements of the environment, but it's an open system. There are many things that might inform what happens there. And so expertise alone isn't going to do it. We do need expertise, but we also need multiple perspectives. And finding the balance between these two things has been a really important part of our work in Cornwall. To put that in a bit of context, so these are some of the ways that we talk about the climate emergency currently. So you've probably seen the climate stripes model. So we use that on our website at Cornwall Council. This is a graphic that talks about why we're aiming for 2030, why we're trying to avoid 1.5 degree increase in temperature. We've since replaced the bear with a picture of a seal because bears went extinct in Cornwall quite a while ago, so it wasn't necessarily resonating with people. And then finally, this is a kind of a picture of how we would encourage people to go about this, individuals, businesses, etc. And the key thing to note is that these are all making the problem complicated. They're very kind of discrete bits of data. I mean, the second one is literally an equation. If this happens, then it'll be this and this and this and this. The third one's a little bit more getting into complex, but it's still, making these compartmentalized areas where action needs to be taken. And so I share this because, yes, it is a complex problem, but sometimes we need to communicate it in a complicated way. And when we're talking about action plans and co-design and co-creation, we need to be able to lean into that complication. But if we're doing that, we have to make sure we don't lose sight of the bigger picture. And actually, none of these images really convey what is going to happen. They're very, very limited. So this has kind of been my attempt to visualize that in a slightly different way. And this graphic, I think, can feel quite confusing initially, but I'll kind of talk you through it and hopefully it will make sense. So we're effectively moving along this grey line from left to right. And getting concentrically closer to carbon neutrality. That's the plan for the next 10 years and maybe more. We will get closer and closer to that goal. But we also, at the same time, have to remember that that is not the main reason we're doing it. We're not aiming for carbon neutrality of its own sake. We're doing it because we think that's our best chance of getting towards our real goal, which is a just, thriving and resilient Cornwall. And thinking about complexity and complication, so carbon neutrality is a complicated problem. We can measure it, we can have a baseline, we can do ongoing monitoring, and yes, it is a bit more, there's a bit more to it than that, but it allows us to build these structures in place. It allows us to plan, put an action plan in place, but it also means we can put these frames around it. Okay, we'll make sure, yes, there are lots of ways we could achieve carbon neutrality, but many of them would exacerbate inequality. Many of them would create more division. So we have to keep these frames in place around social justice, around resilience, around prosperity, in order to meet the complex system goal, which is a just, thriving and resilient Cornwall. So this graphic doesn't explain how we're trying to do that, but it's a helpful way to communicate that balance. And that's what we need to have at all times. Otherwise we risk alienating decision makers and people we want to act because it's too complex and it's too overwhelming, or we run the risk of being target blind and forgetting why we're doing this stuff in the first place, and making the same mistakes that we've made in the past. So how we talk about that in our action plans, break it down into, okay, well, how does control and power come into this? So we talk about the things we can control directly, our buildings, our assets, the things we need funding, extra funding to be able to do, the things we can enable by changing our policies, whether that's about planning or something else, where we can influence other organizations locally through partnership work and strategic connections, and where we need to ask for influence nationally and ask the national government for extra powers or funding. And this being a public document, these are all framed very positively. Here are things we can do, but we also need to think about the negative kind of flip sides of those of, for areas we can enable through funding is another way of saying we cannot afford to do all of the things that we want to do. And areas we can influence locally, we also have to think, well, we have a certain amount of influence, but others have influence as well. And are they trying to influence people to do the same thing as us or conflicting things? And so we have to be quite critical about how we look at these and not just say, great, well, here's our plan. This is what we're going to do in these 5 steps. We need to think, what limitations and tensions does this create for us? So this is part of the challenge of what we're facing. So the context of this, and please do say in the chat if you need me to slow down at all, is so in the UK within local authorities, and obviously local authorities are not the only people creating action plans, but I think it's very relevant. This is from the Place-Based Climate Action Network. What we see is a lot of local authorities have got action plans, but not all of them. And many of them have not updated them since declaring a climate emergency. So clearly we know there's a groundswell of enthusiasm and desire to do this and to respond to what people are seeing. But there are also a lot of limitations and barriers to that. Whether it's a local authority not knowing quite how to create an action plan, or having already created a plan but not necessarily being able to update it towards the target that they've set of 2030 or otherwise. So there is some kind of systemic blockage going on. Within Cornwall, so we approved our action plan in July 2019. We have a pretty comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory for the whole of Cornwall by the University of Exeter. Obviously, there's a lot missing from that. It's, the data is as good as we could get it. It was not done in a co-designed way. So it was done in a few months, fairly behind the scenes, kind of within the sort of the walls of the council, to get it out in time to keep the momentum up from that declaration. So that's an immediate limitation of what it was, and it effectively is about a 60-page document that's around about 120 actions, of which about 80 of them are being progressed at the moment, which is a pretty good hit rate for this kind of thing. But it was always the plan that this was the sort of phase 1 of the carbon neutral Cornwall programme that will end in March of next year, and so we need a new action plan ready to go to replace that, which is what we're working on at the moment. So that's the context in which this is happening. What that action plan needs to do is a kind of a multitude of things. So it needs to do all of the basic things of what do we need to do, how do we do it, when do we do it, who's doing it. But it also needs to look at why haven't these things happened already? I already know it's very likely that many of the things in our action plan are going to be things that we knew we had to do 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And if we just write them down again, then we'll be just putting the same things down in the next action plan. So we need to think, well, why haven't those happened? What is going on there? And be transparent about that. And the answer to a lot of it is going to be, we don't know, or there are very uncomfortable tensions happening somewhere in the system that are blocking that. But until we make them transparent, we won't be able to change them. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. We also needed to build on commitments from every single level of Cornwall, not to delegate responsibility where actually the council should hold it, but to recognise where we are the key actor and where we are not. Where that maybe means the sharing of power, is a really interesting point. And it needs to formalize how we're implementing these things, how we're monitoring them, and how are we reporting them, which we're getting towards, but needs to be better. So I want to talk about the approach that we're taking, this broadly breaks it down. So kind of level one of this approach is many of the, okay, what do we need to do? And it needs to make sure we've got the data in there, what's worked, what hasn't previously. We're looking at mitigation, we're looking at adaptation, which is something that we talk about, but I don't think we quite understand as well as we need to yet. We need a lot more climate modelling on what is likely to happen in Cornwall in the future. I'll talk a bit more about that in the second presentation of ways we're looking at that. We need to incorporate the ecological emergency and the wider system at play and make sure social justice is embedded. So this is all about thinking about it as a complex system rather than a series of complicated ones. But there needs to be a second level to that. So one where we have a distributed leadership where we are coordinating all of the different actors across Cornwall with their various strategies and their various approaches, not duplicating this work, but making sure it's all pointing in the right direction, which is a very easy thing to say, but a very difficult thing to do. We need to make sure it is urgent, it is ambitious. It is not just, we're not just talking about sustainable, we're talking about regenerative. We're beyond the point where sustainable is enough. We need to be regenerating, whether that's in the environment or wherever else. And this last point, which is where what I want to unpack a little bit more, the more jazz, the Mozart analogy comes from the Centre for Sustainable Energy, and a really nice blog about how rather than composing a kind of a symphony like Mozart, where you have really key kind of parts for instruments that are very set down, melodies that everybody has to hit, really specific notes. Doing this work is more about kind of free jazz, where there's an element of improvisation in, people come in and out, and there are notes and there are themes for people to hit, but actually we don't quite know what it's going to look like. I think that was a nice analogy. I kind of prefer to look at it from the frame of emergent strategy. And I want to talk briefly about that. If you're not familiar with it, this comes a lot from the work of Octavia Butler, and there's a really good book by Adrienne Marie Brown that goes into it in a lot of detail, which I would heartily recommend. I've taken a quotation here that describes what emergent strategy is. So plans of action and collective organizing tools that account for constant change and rely on the strength of relationship for adaptation, with a crush on biomimicry and permaculture. So the key things here is about constant change. So it's acknowledging this as a complex system that we cannot tie down and understand completely, but that shouldn't paralyze us into not being able to do anything. What we need to do is focus on, it's the relationships that will get us through this constant change, that will create the kind of dynamics for being able to respond and adapt to change. The pitch of a murmuration is a really nice example of that in action, in terms of the murmuration of a starling has a clear purpose in terms of safety, in terms of finding somewhere to roost, in terms of feeding for these starlings, but it's entirely based on connections. No one starling knows what the rest of them are doing. They're only connected to the few around them, and they follow those. And through the strength of those connections and the trust there, it creates something bigger. And I'm not saying it's a perfect analogy, but it's a way to kind of navigate a lot of this uncertainty and do it in a way that is resilient. And some of the principles I've listed there, I think, are some of the key things to take away from that. One of the key ones is this idea that change is non-linear and iterative. And this is a inherent limitation of action plans, is that many of them look at change as a linear process. If we do this, then this will happen. And politicians obviously have to fall into that kind of process a lot, because they have to say, well, I did this thing and this thing happens as a result. And that can be a benefit. Sometimes that can be useful, but sometimes that can be really, really limiting. And for action plans, we need to step back from that a little bit and understand that we need to nudge the system here and there and let go necessarily of knowing exactly what's going to happen as a result. So thinking emergent strategy is a form of systems thinking, and I think it's important just to quickly acknowledge that there are a lot of risks in that. So one is that systems thinking is really hard, and that shouldn't be underestimated. One is that it isn't one thing you can just do. You can just kind of plonk down and apply it. It's many, many things. There's not one way of doing it. It creates a lot of inaccessible language and jargon. It could really alienate people and be used as a way to kind of consolidate power in that regard. And I think that's really worth acknowledging. And then lastly, if you're creating a space where there is uncertainty, and we're talking about uncertainty, it's really easy then for someone to come in who's already got power and say, oh, this is all a bit scary. No worries, here's what we should do, and consolidate power they already have. And so if you are doing that, going through that process and kind of trying to hold uncertainty, it's something that's really important to be wary of, which is not reason to not to do it, but it's just, I think, needs to be a conscious factor. Another key part of our approach, as well as this idea of emergence, is thinking about consensus and consent. So consensus has been the dominant force, certainly in a lot of our action planning and consultation, and many that I've seen, where we're looking at effectively, we try to want to make everybody happy, because if everybody has to contribute to this, they have to be willing participants. We have to find an alignment of their preferences. But as this graphic really helpfully shows, actually the alignment of preferences is tiny. It's such a small space to operate in that it often ends up with a very watered down approach to what we have agreed to do. But if we can focus on consent, where we're actually looking at tolerance rather than preference, so it's not what everybody wants to happen, it's what can you tolerate? What can you cope with? What's good enough and safe enough? And how do we work from that point? And this comes back to this idea that change is non-linear, because it's not saying, okay, you as a business or an organization who we want to be a part of this action plan, you're doing what you're doing, and you see any change to that as some kind of deviation. But actually, the change is already inbuilt into that process. You're not going to be able to do the things that you're doing in 5, 10, 20 years' time, because resource use is going to change, because the climate is going to change, and it is changing. So it's not about you can do exactly what you want. There is change coming. What kind of change are you happy with? Where is that tolerance? And building something from there. I can talk a little bit more about that if that's of interest, but this has been a really helpful way to think about it. And this definitely comes from the sort of the more transition-y space of doing this kind of work. So lastly, before we break and have discussions, I want to talk briefly about the initial impact. So this idea of distributed leadership has been really helpful. I mean, this is just a list, you don't need to read all of this, but of some of the kind of the various strategies that are developing across Cornwall. And we are trying to knit into this action plan. So it's not a whole separate thing. It's something that links together all of these things, but rather than linking them together from a point of where do they agree, also incorporating where are there tensions between some of these strategies, because they're not all going to agree on their targets, on their preferences, on what they want to happen. So how do we bring those tensions to the fore and make them transparent? Because until we do that, everyone's going to be acting in slightly different ways with slightly different priorities, but not talking about it. So it creates a real problem there for actually getting some groundswell of fairly, the radical action we need to see. So that's been really helpful. This is a slide that kind of sums up some of that. So this is something that we're using to communicate that. So 3 parts of this process: ecological emergency, climate emergency, and adaptation. And how these sit with 3 different parts of the various sort of leadership organisations across Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, the Local Nature Partnership, the Leadership Board, the Strategic Resilience Board, and how these things intersect with each other. So it's kind of working across these 3, and then we're trying to broaden that out to incorporate everything else. For an adaptation strategy that's being developed, for example. So it's early days, but that approach certainly seems to be generating conversations that maybe wouldn't have happened before. And then lastly, this is more in the slightly abstract space, but this is a graphic I've taken from the excellent work of Climate Outreach and their Britain Talks Climate work, where they segmented the UK population and kind of their various approaches or views on the climate and also other issues. And this idea of consent, again, is it's a frame to sort of hold the various tensions between the different people in Cornwall, whether they're individual residents, whether they're business owners, whether they're kind of run anchor institutions, whatever that might be. And how do we try and represent this idea that, yes, our action plan may not be exactly what you want it to look like, but you can see your opinion and your experience in there, but acknowledge that it's part of a bigger thing. I haven't figured out yet how to kind of visualize that. You know, I've got grand ambitions of some kind of sculpture in Cornwall that could be replicated on a smaller scale, that, you know, that people take on personally. I'm not a visual artist, and I'm not going to try and go there, but something, it's a way to start exploring that tension that has been a huge barrier up until now, because every time we put out an action plan, or some kind of way, you know, the immediate reaction was, that doesn't speak for me, I'm not in there. And we don't want to pretend that that's not the case, but we want to be able to talk about it. So that's kind of the first part of what I wanted to talk about, the various sort of approaches that we're taking, and I'll talk more about specifics in the second presentation, but I'll hand back for now and give others a chance to talk.